All right, welcome everyone. We're going to keep adding people as they join in the waiting room, but we will go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for being here today. We're really excited to be chatting with you about plant-based defaults. And my name is Laura Cascada. I'm the Senior Director of Campaigns at the Better Food Foundation, and I'm going to be your moderator today. We have some really great speakers. Just to give you a little bit of a background, the Better Food Foundation is an action tank that incubates novel strategies for shifting diets. We're research informed and we're also impact driven. We aim to accelerate the shift to plant-centered eating that we already see taking place in the world, and to nudge institutions and communities to adopt new norms in which animal products are no longer the central part of our food system. We are here today to talk about the recent study that a lot of you may have heard about that we worked on in collaboration with Food for Climate League, along with Sodexo and two researchers at Boston College. And this study successfully tested the impact of serving plant-based dishes as the default option within dining hall stations at 3 Sodexo-run university dining halls. These were Tulane University, Lehigh, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And this was actually the first ever multi-site research study on plant-based defaults within all you care to eat dining halls. This study had some pretty remarkable findings that you'll hear about shortly, but just to highlight a couple, on days when the plant-based default was happening, we observed an almost 24% reduction in food-related greenhouse gas emissions. And when defaults were implemented consistently at 2 of the sites, the average take rate of these dishes increased from about 30% to over 80% without any other changes to the dining experience. The study also led to Sodexo rolling out plant-based nudges across its approximately 400 campuses across the US. And it was recently published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Environmental Psychology. So I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker, who is Joel Ginn, one of the authors of this study. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the Social Influence and Social Change Lab at Boston College, working with Greg Sparkman, who's the other author of this study. He received his PhD in social psychology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where his research focused on people's beliefs about social change and their perceptions of social change actions and actors. He's primarily focused on environmental action and meat reduction, veganism, and explaining how social identities such as flexitarianism versus vegetarianism and beliefs about the efficacy of individual and systemic actions and how they affect support for and reactions to social movements. His current work extends this, examining the effectiveness of interventions that aim to promote counter-normative behaviors, such as messaging about current trends in society, as well as the use of choice architecture and choice defaults. So I will hand it off to Joel.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here and speaking with you all today and get a chance to share this work. We've got these slides set up. Can everyone see them now? Perfect. All right, so again, thank you so much for having me be able to speak about this work. Thank you to everyone on the call, people from Food for Climate League, the Better Food Foundation, Greener by Default, and Sodexo, in pulling together this work. To start us off, just really saying what many of us already know, but to state for those who this might be a new thing for you, meat consumption really is one of the most impactful individual lifestyle behaviors that people can engage in. It's more impactful than things like recycling or using cold water in your washing machine, things that people readily accept and do in their day-to-day lives, but it still remains a largely counter-normative behavior in our society. So social psychologists and people in the social sciences have been really focused on how can we get people to shift their dietary behaviors using interventions that focus on education and things like that that can be really impactful, but focus on changing one heart, one mind at a time. Whereas the use of choice defaults and choice architecture broadly can change a lot of behaviors very quickly. It's a very scalable type of intervention because it happens at the point of decision making. It's a type of intervention focused on changing how options are presented, setting one option as the express or implied default option. This has been shown to be effective in shifting behavior in things as innocuous as do you get whipped cream on your hot chocolate or not, to things as impactful as organ donation rates and signing up for green energy supplies. Now, there have been some people who have looked at this type of intervention in the realm of plant-based dining and meat reduction. A recent review came out in 2022 looking at some of these initial attempts at this type of intervention. But in reviewing this literature, we felt like there were several limitations that we wanted to try to address with this multi-site field study. The first being that many of these studies looked at online types of behavior and decision making, where people are recruited in an online sample, make a decision absent the psychological richness of a live dining setting. And we know that decisions and intentions that you make in advance don't always relate to what you do when you're presented with the options that are in front of you in a dining setting. Additionally, many of these types of interventions are done using a very controlled environment where there are only 2 or 3 options available for people to choose from. When you're offered the choice between a veggie burger or a traditional meat burger, it's very easy to see the impact of these interventions, but it's harder to quantify how impactful that might be in a setting where people can easily go to a pasta bar, a salad bar, or any number of other options. Additionally, these past studies have largely used a comparison between express meat default to express vegetarian default, comparing a setup where someone is told, here is a meat burger, a vegetarian burger is also available, to a setup where they're presented with a vegetarian burger and told that a meat burger is available upon request. So with that type of comparison, you can easily see a difference, but it's hard to tell if a vegetarian default does anything in comparison to a no default setting that's very business as usual in many large dining settings where 2 options are presented side by side without an express default. It makes it harder to see if the effect is due to the implementation of a plant-based default or the removal of an explicit meat default. So we want to address many of these limitations in our study, and we did so at 3 different university settings, which we think is a very important space to try to shift towards plant-based dining. This is an opinion held by many experts as well, who have called on university dining halls as the key and first place we should focus on in the shift towards a plant-based future because of their potential strength and impact and thought leadership, and as a place where many people dine who are at a place in their life where they are quite malleable in the dietary practices that they're going to engage in and potentially carry forward for the rest of their lives. So that's why defaults are important, some of the limitations of past work. What did we actually do in our study? Well, we, as said, went to 3 different university settings where there were large-scale, all-you-care-to-eat dining facilities where people could go up to any number of stations, see what options were presented, and choose as many as they wished. In this case, for these 3 different university settings, we had 1 experimental setting in each dining hall, 1 station among many that on each day of the study was randomly assigned to either be a no default control of business as usual, where 2 dishes are presented side by side, or a plant-based or vegan default. Over the course of 3 months, we tracked sales at that station, tracking over 15,000 dishes in total to see how many meat and how many plant-based dishes were sold at that station. To give an example of what this default looked like, on the left here we have this control no default scenario where 2 dishes were presented side by side. In this case, 2 bulgogi dishes that are a tofu and beef bulgogi dish. No express default listed. There was signage indicating that both were available, and diners could simply come up and say whichever they wanted. Whereas under a vegan default, the tofu dish was presented and diners could see that directly behind the sneeze guard or set up as the dish that people could choose from, with signage indicating that the meat dish was available upon request. The meat dish was often hidden off to the side, often under a cloche or something like that, to make it easily accessible for dining staff, but not as directly visible to diners in this setting. Additionally, signage was reversed, where normally, as is traditional, the meat dish is listed before the vegetarian dish under the no default control, whereas that order was switched for the vegan default. So there was no limitation, there was no saying people can't have meat. It's simply a change in how dishes are presented that helped set this default. As I said before, we tracked sales data, and we expected to see that under the vegan default, compared to those control days, there should be more servings of vegan dishes sold and fewer servings of meat dishes sold. So what do we find? Well, here on the left, we have a figure where on the x-axis we have the control and plant-based default conditions, the different types of days in this study. And on the y-axis, we have the total number of servings of each dish type, which is indicated by the color of the bar. So under the no default control, you see what we might expect. Most diners are selecting meat dishes compared to plant-based dishes. It's not an unheard of thing for diners to be selecting plant-based dishes, but it is not the norm. Most people are still selecting meat dishes from this station when the default, no default control condition is in place. But when we implemented the plant-based default, we can see that diner behavior shifted quite drastically. In fact, looking at the condition effect, the interaction between condition and dish type, we can see that this difference was highly statistically significant, illustrated by both a 57% reduction in the number of meat dishes served on plant-based default days compared to control days, as well as a 58% increase in this number of plant-based dishes served under the plant-based default compared to control days. We didn't just look at sales data though, we also looked at diner satisfaction to see if we could detect any sort of backlash, if people were negatively reacting to this. We surveyed people that got dishes from that experimental station and asked them how satisfied they were with the total number of offerings or what the offerings were that day in the dining hall. And overall, we found no difference between conditions on overall satisfactions with the offerings. And in fact, when we asked about satisfaction with the specific dishes that they got from that station, we actually see a marked improvement in satisfaction with the vegan dish on default days compared to non-default days. The satisfaction with the meat dish didn't change at all, but when the vegan dish is presented by itself, not alongside or in comparison with the meat dish, people actually report liking that dish better. So overall, from this study, we can say that defaults in this multi-site study are quite effective in promoting plant-based dining choices. And as a secondary bonus to that, diner satisfaction doesn't seem to be harmed by implementing these defaults. In fact, there's some evidence to say people might actually like the vegan dishes better when they're presented as an explicit default. Now, there's more work to be done in this space. People on this call, as well as our team here at Boston College, are continuing to look at how we can make these defaults interventions more or less effective by alternating things such as the salience of the non-defaulted options or how effortful it might be to get the non-defaulted options. But as a baseline, we can say that there is a great potential for these types of interventions in shifting dietary choices. So thank you all. I want to thank my postdoctoral advisor, Greg Sparkman, and all of our collaborators, many of whom were on the call today. If people have any questions about the study, I'm always happy to talk about it. And as said before, this was recently published. So if you have access to that, you can see more details there as well. Thank you.
I think I'm supposed to take it up from here. So I'll follow up with Joel.
Oh, Eve, sorry, I'm about to give your little brief bio.
Oh, perfect.
And
Okay.
then, yeah, thank you. Great. So thank you so much, Joel. And I meant to mention that folks can put questions into the chat. So if you have any questions after Joel's presentation, go ahead and drop those in. And then if you have any, obviously for Eve or Jennifer too, as they speak, we'll be collecting them at the end. And can answer them for you. And also, in case you missed in the chat, we're also inviting everyone to put in their name, academic affiliation, your position. You could also put in any interest or why you have this interest in this or what you're trying to achieve. And we'll love to collect that information from you and get back to you later on individually. So now to move on to Eve. Eve Turow-Paul is the founder and executive director of Food for Climate League, or FCL. She's a globally recognized thought leader on youth food culture and lifestyle trends. Turow-Paul supports groundbreaking strategic narrative and behavioral design research around food and climate issues at FCL. She's been recognized for her insights into the changing landscape of food culture and has appeared in various media outlets to discuss her research and findings. Through her writing and nonprofit leadership, Eve focuses on harnessing food culture as a tool for mental, physical, and environmental health. Her latest book is Hungry: Avocado Toast, Instagram Influencers, and Our Search for Connection and Meaning, from Ben Bella, published in 2020. And it explores the why behind today's biggest food and lifestyle trends. So I will hand it off to Eve.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much for everyone joining this call. It's amazing to see how many people are on this call. It's great. It means there's excitement for this. So Joel already went through the report, the study. I'm here to really kind of give you additional details on the study. So Food for Climate League was really the hub of owning the actual implementation of this. Joel and team were assisting us with the design and with all of the analysis. Better Food Foundation was the amazing support hub that allowed us to do this work in the first place. So just to back up a little bit, why focus on students and why focus on plant forward? So I'm just going to talk for a little bit and then I'll go into kind of why. There are more than 4 million meals served daily across college campuses in the United States. Students will consume 15 billion meals in their lifetime. And the potential impact of shifting college campuses to plant-forward diets is immense. This is the equivalent to taking 2,200 cars, 220,000 cars off the road for an entire year in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking about reducing the demand for meat and dairy. It would be reducing the demand by the quantities of 2.2 million cows, 250 million chickens. It could ideally also increase demand for alternative proteins. It can also be increasing nutrition density of the meals that are actually consumed by these students. And it opens up the doors to more culturally inclusive meals. Most of the food around the world is plant forward. And so there's a lot of really exciting things here. And then of course, there's cost benefits. There's an average savings of 59 cents per meal with plant-based defaults. And so at Food for Climate League, we are all about really nudging people towards more climate smart choices, but we're not encouraging people to do it simply because it is better for the environment. We know that there are other practical things that all of us need to be paying attention to in our businesses. And plant-based defaults is one of these beautiful solutions where it's satisfying the economic demands, it's satisfying the student interest, the food service interest, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to go into this study with just a little bit more detail, a little bit of a different perspective, because we were measuring some slightly different things than Joel and Greg were. So just to back up again, this was at 3 different university dining hall stations. It was at Tulane, Lehigh, and RPI in New York City. And we were alternating between these plant-based default days and non-default days. And Joel kind of showed you what that looks like. Again, this is an example of what that setup looks like. On the control day setup, you're listing the meat dish first, list the plant-based dish second. You're seeing both things as you walk up to the station. What is a plant-based default day? It means that you're listing the plant-based dish first and the meat dish second. So you're flipping the norm. And actually, the most important part of this for us was the visual. You couldn't see the meat dish in front of you. You saw the plant-based option, but then there was always signage to say, if you want the meat-based option, just let us know. You're not taking away choice. In fact, on many of these stations, we increased the choice. What we heard from a lot of students and from the Sodexo operators was, we actually didn't even offer a plant-based option here before. And so our control day was still not business as usual. It was actually something different from business as usual. And that alone ended up being an intervention that inspired change at Sodexo, which is really, really exciting because the students were jazzed. They were like, oh, we just have more options than we did before. And so we really were trying to also address some research gaps. So there's extensive research on default, and we were so lucky to work with Dr. Greg Sparkman and Joel on this, who really are kind of the leaders in academia around defaults. But we were looking at how easy is this to actually implement in a real world setting? What's going to happen in terms of diner satisfaction and staff satisfaction? Because at Food for Climate League, we're really trying to bridge the gap between academia and real world. How do we get this applied in the real world? And then, of course, does it work in terms of greenhouse gas reduction? And then does it also work in an all-you-care-to-eat environment? So there's a lot of default work in retail and a la carte settings. This was the first of its kind to be testing a default setup in an all-you-care-to-eat environment. And it worked, which is amazing because it means that this can work in a greater number of types of settings. I think Joel's kind of gone through this already, so I'm not going to relay that too much. But again, really, we were so pleased to see that plant-based defaults are not a high effort to the staff. So, right, we're all dealing with, any food service operators dealing with the fact that we have overtaxed food service staff. We don't want to introduce a change that people are going to find too cumbersome. and happily this wasn't too cumbersome, it also maintained diner satisfaction. And in some cases, the diner satisfaction went up. This also did work in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. I also want to emphasize that we learned from failures in this study. So there were 3 campuses, 2 of them implemented it really well, 1 did not. I think there was a little bit of an attitude of like, I have too much on my plate. I can't start this and stop it and start it and stop it. It wasn't a randomized control trial, but we learned from those failings because what we saw is the increase of plant-based dishes served between the control and the intervention was, 26% to 57%. But at the 2 locations that implemented this most effectively, it went up to 81.5%. Meanwhile, what we found on the 1 campus that didn't implement this as effectively, it really was about staff buy-in. The staff wasn't really bought into setting this up in the right way so the students could actually see the meat, so it largely negated the effect of the default. But it also was the body language of the staff. It also was the actual verbal interaction. So we did get one of these notes from our research assistants. When one student asked for both the beef and the tofu, the server asked, "Even the tofu?" in a kind of surprised voice. And for us, this also was a learning that in order to implement this in a way that's going to be highly effective, you can't just give the guidance on what to do. You really need to be engaging the frontline hourly workers who are the true change makers here. You can't just give a directive from, the top down. We really need the folks who are actually cooking and serving the food to understand the why and to be bought into this. So we learned a lot from running this experiment. We learned that when you do implement this consistently, you can drastically increase the selection of plant-based dishes, decrease the selection of meat-based dishes, and ultimately result in lower greenhouse gas emissions. We also found that the incorrect implementation will cause that effect to completely vanish. We also found that students, including meat eaters, are open to plant-based options. One of the campuses ended up introducing I think it was a chana masala, but I'm gonna have to go back, was a plant-based dish that they had initially said, like, this is not gonna fly. Lo and behold, they put it on the menu and students were going crazy for it, and then it stayed on the menu, right? And that's really what we wanna see. Yes, we were doing a randomized controlled trial study. What is really a success for us, though, is seeing that many of these campuses just kept these changes on menu long-term. So number 4 is also that the dining staff found it pleasant and easy to implement in most cases, except for this 1 campus where there was a little bit of pushback, but on the other 2, there really wasn't. And we also understood kind of why there were hiccups on the 1 site where there was. But we also did learn that eating meat continues to be the social norm. And that is something that we're all continuing to battle against. But I think that this is such a profoundly impactful way to start to shift that norm, right? Anyone in marketing says you should introduce a new product or a new habit in a moment of life disruption. Going to college is a moment of disruption, right? Starting a family, graduating, all of these kind of core moments in your emerging adulthood are the times to intervene for long-term behavioral change. And so making these kinds of shifts on a college campus can have profound impacts in the long run. So we really do see the ROI of plant-based defaults is extraordinarily high if you are in a university setting. So just a few top tips for you on implementing defaults. Start small. You can start at 1 station and improve the sustainability of your operation. That was also something really exciting about this. We did it at 1 station. We also did track to see, were students going elsewhere? We took that into account in our analysis. You can start small, right? If it goes well, expand it to other stations. Number 2, you have to engage your dining hall staff. Really needs to be a shared understanding of why you are asking people to change the setup, why you might be shifting the recipe preparation. And then, most importantly, the food's got to be good and it's got to look good. It's really interesting to see kind of where people have a comparison, how that changes their perceptions. But a lot of the food that got the highest ratings, it just looked really great. Especially Gen Zers, there's tons of data on this. They determine what to eat based on how it looks. Not shocking for a generation that's been raised with the world of Instagram, but something to be really mindful of. So where are we at now? we're trying to get this widely implemented. So how are we doing that? We're taking our learnings. Right now, we are pairing up with the Menus of Change University Research Collaborative, Greener by Default, Better Food Foundation, continuing to work with the amazing people on this call to develop, number one, an implementation toolkit. That's not just about plant-based defaults, but other ratios, other norms, messaging tips that you can apply throughout your dining hall. We want to create something that's a bit more plug and play for food service operators, because we understand that every single food service operation is a little bit different. You need to decide what nudges should you apply in these different areas. So number one, it's creating a really practical toolkit that food service operators can use. Number two is developing a staff training, because we learned the staff needs to be bought in. This is not just about the how, it's about the why. And this is really about food and food service. What we learned at Food for Climate League, we focus on behavioral design, changing perception, changing behavior. Food is love. You can't ask people to serve food that they're not excited about in a way they're not excited about it. It's going to show up in the way that the food is perceived by others. It's going to show up even in the flavor of the dish. So this is about really getting that buy-in from your line level hourly workers, who again are the people who are making and serving the food. They are the true tastemakers. And we need to be considering those individuals as key stakeholders in this process. And so we're also developing a training module. And then it's about getting it out there into the world. We are still fundraising for this. I do think it's going to be one of the most high impact projects we have ever taken on as an organization. If your institution is interested also in becoming a pilot partner, if you know anybody who would be interested in actually financially supporting this effort, please do let us know. We are getting things started next month. We've started our kind of brief kickoff calls. I'm really excited to get this out into the world. If you want any additional information on the existing study, obviously check out Joel's publication. But there's also an executive summary that we've developed on the Food for Climate League website. So you can scan that QR code. You can go to the link, however you want to access it. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eve. We are so grateful for all the work that FCL put into driving this study forward. It's just amazing to have worked with you all, and I'm really excited to see how these future plans unfold. So I'm going to switch it over to Jennifer, and Jennifer Channin is our executive director here at BFF. She is part of the team that founded the Better Food Foundation in 2016, and she served as our executive director since 2021. She has also served in the nonprofit sector for more than 20 years as development director for Farm Forward and Found in Translation, program coordinator for the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, and development consultant to more than a dozen nonprofits. She's raised tens of millions of dollars for farmed animal protection and social justice organizations in the United States and internationally. Jennifer is also an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister who has served congregations in the US and Canada. She earned her Master's of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School and her Bachelor's of Arts in International Development from McGill University. Jennifer is a dual citizen of the US and Brazil and lives in Julian, California with her partner, Aaron, and their dog, Buddy. And take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you. And Laura, can you see everything fine and hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. So thanks for joining. I'm going to go a little further back in time before this study took place and give some background as to why we felt like strategies like this were really important in our work. We launched the project, which we call DefaultVeg, in 2018. And we started doing this work because of insights that our team members had as campaigners and consultants for a variety of different campaigns to encourage more sustainable food, more plant-based food on campuses and other institutions. We had team members who had worked on promoting or officially working for Farm Forward's Leadership Circle, which had a less and better food policy for universities, advocates for Meatless Mondays campaigns on campus, advocates for the Real Food Challenge. We had team members who were consultants for the ASHE STARS program, which is a sustainability rating program for universities, and the Center for Good Food Purchasing, which has sustainability and food standards that cities adopt in their public school system. And after working on all of these different campaigns, we realized that there were some major barriers to having meaningful impact when it comes to reducing animal products. And when I say meaningful impact, that really means, are we achieving our ultimate bottom line goals? If our bottom line goal is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, are we reducing the consumption of animal products to such a degree that it really impacts greenhouse gas emissions? If our bottom line is having students eat healthier, does that really happen if we simply make some healthy options available, or do we need to go further? And so we identified three barriers in the kinds of campaigns that we had been working on previously. One barrier, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, is fear of pushback. That's the number one reason why decision makers are hesitant to begin initiatives to reduce the amount of animal products they serve. And this fear of pushback might be fear of students and diners no longer being happy with the food. You know, we see a lot of advertising that tells us that everybody wants meat and cheese all the time. And so it can be a little bit frightening to not offer those as plentifully as previously. But there's also fear of pushback about our community. You know, for universities, it might be, what will our alumni think? Or what will media think? Or what will local politicians think right now at a time when, you know, everything, including food, is becoming polarized? Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. All right. The second barrier that we saw is that commitments aren't the same thing as follow through. Most of the campaigns that I posted on the previous slide are campaigns that get institutions to make a commitment to serving food differently. And as we know, if you don't know how to achieve a commitment, if you don't have the implementation know-how, or it simply becomes too difficult, then often they just won't follow through and you don't get the actual impact. And a third barrier is that we noticed again and again that when we went to an institution like a university and we asked them to reduce the amount of animal products they served, what we did was create a kind of adversarial relationship where we were the ones hoping to reduce animal products the most, and the institutional decision makers were hoping that we could come up with a number to reduce them the least. And all of this ended up reinforcing the centrality of animal products and creating a kind of conflict in the relationship. So we would get, low commitments like 10% reduction or 20% reduction. And ultimately, when this work was talked about, it would send the kind of message that plant-based foods were really the exception rather than the norm, and that students who were choosing plant-based foods were a minority who needed to be accommodated rather than just a normal kind of diner who we were trying to serve better. So how do we get around these barriers? One way to try to get around a barrier is to push through it. That's not a pretty easy ways to do it. Another way is to climb over it. So after doing this work for years, we wanted to see if there was an easier way. Could we go around these barriers? Could we find ways to circumvent these challenges rather than need to overcome very difficult things like cultural pushback and people's fear of conflict? So how does DefaultVeg get around these barriers? First, I should say what DefaultVeg is. DefaultVeg is really a collection of strategies that include nudges. Nudges is anything that changes the way an option is presented to you. Another term for this is choice architecture. So anytime you're shopping, anytime you're making a choice, the way it's presented to you nudges you towards one choice rather than another. And nudges are everywhere. So the way that DefaultVeg gets around these is that number one, it circumvents pushback. And it does this by making the change about improving choices rather than taking away choices. So when you make plant-based foods the default, or when you serve food in such a way that plant-based foods are the easiest food to access or the most plentiful food, you don't have to take away other students' choices. They can still eat what they want. Students who want animal products can get them. And that means that from diners themselves, we receive very little pushback. But second, this is a change that takes place in the dining service. It takes place in the cafeteria, at the event, at the party. It doesn't take place in the media or in the public. So the first step that you take when you want to try using plant-based nudges is to just try them, to use them. So by the time you're ready to talk about this work in the public, you already have an example of it being successful, and you don't need to get that kind of public buy-in in order to start. A second way that default veg strategies get around these barriers is that plant-based nudges are follow-through. They're not a commitment for which follow-through comes later. They are the implementation. So by starting with nudges rather than with commitments, the impact that you see is immediate. And so even if you're starting just at a small scale, trying a simple nudge in one aspect of the way you serve food, for example, by making oat milk or plant milks the default milk and having folks ask for dairy milk, you're going to see impact immediately. And this means that you can still make a commitment. You can still include this impact in your climate action plan, but you can do so after you've already had success piloting the changes on campus and you know what kind of results you're going to see. A third way that default veg gets around these barriers is that because it's about increasing inclusivity, increasing choices, it ends up normalizing plant-based diners and normalizing plant-based dining not only for students who are vegetarian or vegan, but all students who are exposed to this environment where plant-based foods are now more prevalent and more centered in the eating experience. There's an idea called universal design, which is often used to design spaces or experiences for people who have different kinds of levels of ability. And the idea of universal design is that you want to serve the most students as possible by meeting the needs of the most marginalized students. So when it comes to food, the most marginalized students are going to be students who have dietary restrictions, like being lactose intolerant, people who have religious restrictions on what they eat, people who have ethical restrictions. And if you can serve food in a way that everybody can eat these foods and you don't need to make an exception for those students, you're going to be serving both the most students at once and you're going to be meeting the needs of those who have the greatest need. And the other aspect of this promoting inclusivity is that this is an approach that encourages cooperation between students, sustainability offices in the schools dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, accessibility, academics, and dining. This is an approach that really you can approach decision makers on your campus through a variety of lenses and be solutions oriented, come to them with ways to solve their problems rather than coming to them with problems that you want them to solve. So I'm going to talk a little more about inclusivity, because if we say we want to serve the most students at once in the way that we present our food options to them, it helps to understand what food norms are amongst college students. So I want to say a little bit about Gen Z food norms that are on the rise. And one is that we are seeing in the United States an increased openness to plant-centered eating among Gen Z. But it's important to note that this increased openness to plant-centered eating is not necessarily the same as identifying as vegetarian or vegan. So we can share, and you can find on our website, a lot of the research behind this, but it includes statistics like 60% of Gen Z saying in surveys that they want to eat more plant-based food, and 80% reporting that they already eat plant-based foods a few times a week. And what this means for us is that when we serve food, we should market plant-based foods to everyone and not just to certain students. And when we make plant-based foods the default, that is what we're doing. We're encouraging everyone to choose them, not only folks who feel like they need to because of a dietary restriction. A second major trend that we see taking place is that plant-centered eating is growing fastest in BIPOC communities. A few years ago, the Pew Research Center came out with a major national study of food trends in the United States. And one thing they learned is that among African Americans, 8% of African Americans report that they have some kind of plant-based diet, compared to only 3% of white Americans. And that amongst BIPOC communities, people choosing plant-centered eating is growing more rapidly than in other parts of the population. There's a variety of reasons for this. One is people wanting to be more intentional about their health. Another is greater understanding about lactose intolerance and folks wanting to eat diets that are better for their bodies. There's been some great journalism covering this issue, but we also know it's taking place even more rapidly amongst Gen Z and younger generations. And so there's an increasing perception that if plant-based foods are accessible, particularly plant-based milks, and that means having them be the same price or cheaper than dairy milks, that we're making our campuses more accessible and more inclusive towards some of the most marginalized communities amongst our students. And a third trend we should be aware of is that overall amongst Gen Z, there's an increased reported interest in healthy eating. A lot of students are reporting some kind of diet that they're on. But it's important to know that there is disagreement on what the meaning of healthy is. And not everybody defines healthy as plant-based. And so our recommendation is that when we do an initiative like serving plant-based foods by default, we emphasize having as many healthy choices as possible, rather than claiming one food is healthier than another. We also encourage you to talk about the positives. So, one way I like to think about beginning an initiative like making plant-based foods the default is, how are we going to talk about this when the initiative is over? What are we going to be able to say? And so we don't just encourage changes in the dining hall. We encourage changes in how we talk about plant-based food in order to normalize and emphasize the positiveness of them. So here's some sample language. You could take a screenshot if you want of something you might say the year after you initiate a Plants by Default initiative. You might say, we've aligned the food we serve to be more inclusive of the diverse ways our students eat, to provide better access to nutritious foods to our most socially and economically vulnerable students, and to better reflect the values that our students have reported they care about. Now, students who seek more ecologically sustainable, ethically sourced, and plant-rich foods have more choices, while meat and dairy remain available to anyone who wants them. We've rolled out these improvements over the last year and are happy to report that student satisfaction in dining has gone up and overall food costs have remained steady. And so just think for a moment about the difference in how that kind of announcement feels compared to the sort of announcements we're much more likely to see, which is before any change has actually been made to food on campus, a student organization or the university will publish some announcement saying that we intend to reduce the consumption or reduce the serving of meat and dairy on our campus, and then the kinds of reactions that we get to that. So finally, I want to share a bit about our DefaultVeg Student Ambassador Program, because our goal is to make it as easy as possible to transform food on campuses. And to do this, we train students to be resources to you if you work in sustainability or dining, to help you successfully use plant-based nudges in a variety of settings on campus. We train students to talk about the positive aspects of increasing plant-based food choices and accessibility. We train students to partner productively with their sustainability offices, academic programs, and dining staff. And we train students to connect their school's decision makers to NGOs like Food for Climate League and Greener by Default and other groups who were involved in this study, who have the expertise needed to implement nudges. A second thing that our DefaultVeg student ambassadors can help with is that they can pilot projects on campus that demonstrate the popularity, ease, and impact of using plant-based nudges. And these projects can be small scale, like events, clubs, or cafes. They can be the precursor to rolling out something on a grander scale in dining halls. This can be a student internship project. This can be a service learning project that students do as part of their coursework. And one project that has been really popular amongst our student ambassadors during the last year is projects to get campus cafes to remove upcharges for plant-based milks or to serve oat milk as their default. And the pictures are some examples of signs that were put up during student-led pilot oat milk projects at University College London, at Pitzer and Pomona College, and at the University of San Diego. And finally, a way that student ambassadors can help you if you are a decision maker in your school's food or sustainability office is that students can collect data that demonstrates that there is student support for dining improvements. So we partner with the University of San Diego Center for Food Systems Transformation so that when we have a student ambassador collecting data on campus, they're collecting it in a way that's going to be useful to you and can be organized in a central repository that's available to be studied. We're creating an experiential learning module for courses that we're going to be rolling out this fall, where students can, as part of their research learning requirements, collect data about food on their campus and student interest in more plant-based foods. And we help to coordinate and raise funds for larger scale research projects, for example, like the one that was the two previous speakers spoke about, but also ones that can be carried out by individual graduate students and faculty. So finally, you can learn a lot more if you go to our website, www.betterfoodfoundation.org. There's also a sign-up page on our website for student ambassadors and for professionals, if you work in sustainability, to regularly receive updates, more opportunities for trainings, tips, resources, and easy DIY guides for implementing plant-based nudges and defaults anywhere you serve food, whether it's at the scale of a dining hall or just a simple event. So I'll pause here and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate all the great information from all the panelists today. We will be sending out the presentation recording and slides afterwards. Just give us a day or so, and also a few links that were included in the presentations and some helpful tools that we've created. And this will also give you an opportunity. You'll have our email addresses. So if you individually want to reach out for any help or assistance or ask more questions, you'll have the ability to contact any of us. So yeah, now we will transition over to questions. And I've actually brought my colleague here. She's graciously been here collecting questions from the chat. Kenzie, who is our outreach manager, there are some of the questions that were already answered by Joel and Eve throughout the presentations. Thank you both for that. And Kenzie will jump in and pose any of the other audience questions that haven't been answered, and feel free to keep dropping questions. We have about 9 minutes, so we'll try to get through all of them.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. Well, Eve and Joel did an amazing job going through and answering some of those questions. The only one that I saw that wasn't answered, I think this one was for Joe. Amana asked, did participants and students know that the study was happening? And was there any marketing associated with it?
I was gonna say, Eve, if you want to answer that first part, I can chime in with some additional details.
Yeah, so we didn't give the students a heads up. We really were trying to see what happens just when you implement the default. And we didn't want to, we were trying to remove as many other variables as possible to make this as clean of a study as possible. The only students who obviously knew were the RAs. So in order to run this, we hired students on campus to do interviews. Students were probably made aware afterwards because RAs are going up to them asking their opinions. That's how we got our satisfaction data. But otherwise, no, there was no like promotional information that was put out.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's no promotional information, as Eve said. You might expect that some people might notice that there is something different going on, but I don't think we have reason to suspect that students knew that like overall dishes were being tracked or that their choices were being tracked. Importantly, this was, in reference to another question, this was kind of not explicitly every other day. It was randomized, so on average you could say it was every other day, but it switched back and forth between the control and default and conditions. Other people who've done similar types of work often will do like a period that is all one type of and default, and then all another type of default, which is a pretty drastic shift. But you can see like, okay, it's changed, and then in that setup, you know what to expect each day when you come into the dining hall. You come in and it's a vegan default. It'll probably continue to be that for the next coming weeks. In this study, students came into the dining hall not knowing whether it would be a control or default setup on that given day. And since we've published this work, there have been some other people who have been looking at other types of interventions that are similar to this, and people have similarly looked at satisfaction or things like how aware people were of something going on, and it's very low percentage of students, like less than 5% of students actually report even that they think something is going on, much less having like a very specific idea. So this really is despite being a very drastic intervention in terms of like you're literally hiding a dish, it's fairly innocuous in the actual experience of students as they're going through the dining hall.
Yeah, I also just want to build on that to say, so the next, iteration of this work that we are putting together is going to be dining hall wide. And in that, we do have like a pace of rollout that's recommended. So the recommendation is not to flip the entire dining hall in one day. It is to roll it out in a few different stations, station by station, kind of give people, also staff, time to adapt and learn. But it's not, at least we didn't see any large pushback at all from students. Again, it really was more so excitement because they had more options available to them.
Great, thank you all. So we do have a couple that were submitted in advance and a couple that we got through, I guess, private messages in the chat. So hopefully we have about 5 minutes to get to those. So one person was curious about whether when the pilot ends, if you measured whether people continue to eat higher rates of the plant-based foods, and if not, is that something that future studies will look at?
I'm really sorry. Can you repeat it? I got distracted by someone bringing up Maya in the chat who were actually looking on the next version.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Just basically if it was measured whether people continued to eat higher rates of plant-based foods even after the pilot stopped and it went back to the norm or the pre-norm. And if not, if that's something that future studies will look at.
We did not track this ongoing for cost and logistic reasons, but again, we did see that some campuses kept some of these plant-based dishes on menu. We also saw that we had de-risked this for Sodexo. And as a result of this, they then made the recommendation for all of their universities to be 50% plant-based and 50% not. That was a big shift in their menu recommendations for all of their universities. So long-term, yes, this is having impact. Are we tracking it on a meal by meal, level? No. But we also do know that exposing people to tasty food that just happens to be plant-based is a really great way to change perceptions. And that's really what we're trying to do with this work.
Also, I would say, like, not in terms of data did we track this, but from a social psychological perspective, we know that the role of habit in dietary decision making can be a really powerful force. And in this study, people, day to day are getting different types of setups. It's an open question of, does this carry on after the intervention? Does this carry over to their dietary decisions that they're making outside of the default setting? This is having a great impact because for many students, they're getting a lot of their meals, if not a majority of their meals, from a campus dining setting. So it's having impact that then can carry over. It's just a question of, if you get someone freshman year and have them be exposed to this type of default for years and years and years, will that carry on? I would argue, people are forming habits in that case. Whereas if you expose people to a vegan default for a few days, like about half of 3 months, that might carry over, it might not, but if you continue to implement it, it should have carry-on effects.
Great. The next question is whether there is one-on-one help available if a dining hall wants to start implementing. I know Eve mentioned earlier that there's some upcoming plans to create trainings and guidance, but right now, I guess, yeah, is there one-on-one help available?
I mean, I think the number one place to go to is Greener by Default, which was spun out of the DefaultVeg program at Better Food Foundation. So it's really, utilizing Better Food Foundation's methodology. Greener by Default is, I believe, I don't work there, but I believe they're doing site level interventions. But again, the goal of the next stage of this work is to develop open source material so that any campus can implement this. So again, if you know anybody who wants to support this, we're really trying to get it fully funded so that we can make this happen and make these materials and trainings widely available.
I'll add as well, it's either already up or it's going to go up very soon, is we have a do-it-yourself tool on our website that if you are a decision maker at a dining hall, but also if you are an event planner, if you are just simply ordering food for a specific kind of program, you can go through this sort of step-by-step questionnaire and it'll ask you how you're serving food and it'll tell you which nudges you can use to encourage plant-based dining. And it's very simple and it's free and it's on our website.
Great. Thank you both. And on that note, I will make sure everybody gets the link to that. I think it probably will actually be up in the next week or two, but I'll send that around because I do think it's going to be a really great tool. And also about Greener by Default, we do work with them. They're a partner organization. So if anybody is specifically looking for help, you want to reach out to us, we can help you collaborate between us and them to get you plugged into the best kind of support. So we have 1 minute left, and I see there was a question that popped up about whether we'd be able to help if there was a university in Canada. This person works at University of Toronto. Okay, I see you've just answered that. Also, we do have a couple of organizations and another faculty member who are working on University of Toronto. So somehow we can get you all connected, and that way there's multiple people supporting each other rather than kind of reinventing the wheel between each other. And one last question. What would be the next best strategy for people who are trying to make this happen, but the dining hall just won't budge on it and do like a full default? Is there like a second recommendation that you would have?
Yeah, well, I'll say, and I'm assuming you're at a university context, which is food is served in so many ways other than the dining hall. So I would next start with catering and events, and I would go to departments which organize large events and conferences and ask them to change their event sign up so that, when you sign up for an event, instead of checking the box, do you have these kinds of dietary restrictions, it says all meals will be 100% plant-based unless you check a box that says that you require meat or dairy. And that simple switch is a really, really easy way to try out defaults at some large events, and your catering office will then be encouraged to comply by creating delicious plant-based dishes for your events.
Thank you. Any final words from any of our panelists? All right. Thank you all so much. I know we went a minute over, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording.